And now we are going to turn our attention towards the opera Romeo and Juliet. Let us begin by looking at this clip. Mm. Those voices, amazing. So before I introduce our next presenter, I want to note that during this next segment, you are going to be seeing some selected Shakespeare performances from the cast of HBO Max's homeschool musical, Class of 2020, and I'm going to tell you more about those performers in a moment. But now let me introduce our next presenter. Imagine, if you will, that I distributed a bunch of bingo cards with Shakespeare scholarship buzzwords. By the time I finish reading Dr. Dympna Callaghan's biography, every single card would be completely full. A foremost expert on Shakespeare and the English Renaissance, she has held fellowships at the Folger, Huntington, and Newberry libraries. She has been president of the Shakespeare Association of America, and she has enjoyed major academic appointments on 3 continents. She joins us today from Syracuse University, where she is a university professor and the William L. Safire Professor of Modern Letters in the Department of English. If you enjoy what you hear today, please check out her edition of Romeo and Juliet from Bedford St. Martin's. And now, without further ado, the woman that we at the Met Education Department fondly refer to as the magical Shakespeare lady, Dr. Dympna Callaghan. Hello. Welcome, welcome. Would you unmute yourself?
Oops. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it was a real privilege to listen into the bit of the last session. What a fascinating group of people. And I'm just delighted to be with you and really excited to talk about, as ever, about Romeo and Juliet, and especially to demonstrate, to show these performances, which I think you'll find quite remarkable.
Well, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Great. So the opera that you're looking at, Charles Gounod's Romeo and Juliette, was composed in 1857, whereas Shakespeare's play was probably written in about 1595. We're not absolutely certain about the dates of Shakespearean performance, first performances, but we think 1593, 1595. I'm going to go with 1595, although there's some scholarly argument about these things, as there is about so many things. And of course, this story wasn't original to Shakespeare any more than the story was original to Gounod when he wrote the opera. So it was a story that came from Luigi della Porta, an Italian novella. But Shakespeare got the story primarily from a narrative poem by somebody called Arthur Brooke. And that poem was called Romeo and Juliet. And the difference between the narrative poem that Shakespeare used to transform his story was that Arthur Brooke blamed the young people, which will be a real shock to us, I think, because for us, Romeo and Juliet are the paradigm of heterosexual erotic love in the Western world. They are the, if you wanted innocent, beautiful lovers who suffered because of their society and their environment and their families, it would be Romeo and Juliet. But Arthur Brooke didn't see it that way. And I think this is very significant to see what Shakespeare added to the story as he received it. And Arthur Brooke felt the young people did wrong. Why? Because they ran off and got married without parental consent. And that was a complete no-no at the time. You mustn't do this. Because marriage was understood to be the alliance between various families. And there were social constraints at every level of Elizabethan society, because this is the reign of Elizabeth I, obviously. But those constraints got intensified as you went up the social strata. Why? Because more money was involved in aristocratic marriages. But the Capulets and the Montagues are kind of, they're not exactly aristocratic. Some editions call them Lord and Lady Montague, but we're not quite sure. They're a little kind of lower aristocracy, but probably more, merchant kind of classes, well-to-do, but not really high, not dukes and duchesses for sure. So that's really significant. And Arthur Brooke felt they're to blame, whereas Shakespeare, from the very beginning of the play, tells us, you know what, it's the parents' fault. And that's really very interesting that he takes that view, because there would certainly have been people in his audience who didn't agree. And so let me just read the very beginning of the play. I don't know if you have it there or if Dan can show you the chorus at the opening, but anyway, I'll just read it. The opening of the play is actually a sonnet, and that's very significant for reasons that I'll discuss in a minute. But two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage, the which if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss our toil shall strive to end. Now, I'd like to just emphasize those first two lines. This is about civil war that's breaking out. Two households, both alike in dignity. We don't really know what the cause of this feud is, but if ever there were a play more relevant to current times, this is a divided society for reasons that are kind of hard to discern, and the play never tells us what the source of the feud is. It's a bit like the Hatfields and the McCoys. By the time you dig back into history, it's not really clear. Maybe it's clear to somebody here, but I've never really quite understood what the Hatfield and the McCoys feud in West Virginia really was about, or what if there was something really significantly substantive that caused it. But here there certainly isn't. We don't know. It's almost their similarity that's led to their competitiveness and loathing of one another. But two households, those are the first two words of the play. And this play is about coupling. It's about how people come together. It's about friendship, and it's also about erotic bonds and what's involved there. But here, the society, the outside world is responsible, and also that they are star-crossed lovers. The fates have conspired too, but Shakespeare gives very specific substance to what those fates do, namely that it's the parents and the feud that bring it about, that the young people themselves would have come together. And don't forget that a lot of wars ended with a marital alliance. That's how you achieve peace. And that's what the friar hopes. He marries them secretly, Friar Lawrence, because he thinks, so you know what, this could bring the end of the feud. But of course it doesn't. And that's the complication. Things go awry. It might have all worked out. Of course, what happens is the young men of Verona are also continuing this feud. And Tybalt kills Mercutio, who is Romeo's best friend, immediately after Romeo's just got married in secret. And Romeo then kills his killer, who is Tybalt, who is Juliet's cousin. And this causes the prince to arrive on the scene. Or sometimes in some texts he's called Duke Aeschylus, and he comes and he says Romeo must be banished. And even this might have resolved in time, but for the fact that he goes to Mantua in his banishment, and of course there's plague, so the message doesn't get through to him that when Juliet's father tries to marry her to someone else, namely the County Paris, that she has taken a sleeping draught provided by Friar Lawrence, and so he doesn't know when he finds her in the tomb that she's not really dead. He takes poison. Then she wakes up, sees that he's dead, and stabs herself. So it's a very tragic kind of ending, but it's got all the ingredients of the present day: plague, division, a divided, civil blood makes civil hands unclean. That there's this terrible division, and you've got this kind of pestilence, which prevents open communication, etc. So I've given you a very quick summary of the story, which Gounod largely follows, but with a few differences. But what he mainly does, though, because obviously, an opera is about bringing the emotion of a text through the music primarily, not really through the libretto, although there's certainly some element of that. My cat's just walked into the room, so if she walks across my desk, I hope you'll forgive me. But why don't we look at the moment that Romeo and Juliet meet? And I think you'll see how the opera picks up on this moment. And another thing I want to alert you to before we begin is that this is an exchange. Romeo and Juliet meet at this party at Capulet's house. Romeo and Mercutio have sneaked in, so to speak. Capulet, old Capulet, knows that they're there. He doesn't mind, but Tybalt is enraged, and Capulet tries to control him. These violence-prone young men are a real problem in Verona. So these are the circumstances in which the two meet. Now, the other key element here is that Romeo has been in love with somebody else prior to this moment, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Just enjoy this wonderful little performance by these incredible students.
If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this: my lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss.
Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss.
Have not saints lips, and holy palmers too?
Ay, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer.
Oh then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair.
Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake.
Then move not, while my prayer's effect I take. Thus for my lips by thine, my sin is purged.
Then have my lips the sin that they have took?
Sin from my lips? O trespass sweetly urged, give me my sin again.
You kiss by the book.
I think that's fabulous. I love Romeo's kissing. It's just great. They're both terrific. And I think Juliet expresses that kind of, modesty that we associate with this young girl who's going to be 14 on Lammas Eve. Lammas Eve is the last day of July, and that's why she's called Juliet. And the play is associated with the dog days, as they're called, the hot days of summer, when the couples are abroad, as we're told at the very beginning of the play. So, tempers are raging and passions are high. And if Dan could just show us the second miniature, which is by Nicholas Hilliard, which is a little miniature portrait of a young man in flames. But this is Petrarch. We're going to talk about him in a minute. Let's look at the second one first. This is the young man in flames, and you see he's got a locket around his neck, which has got a picture of his beloved. Why are there flames? Well, there are flames because these are the passion of love. And in this case, it's unrequited love. But of course, Romeo and Juliet, we just saw this mutual exchange. So we can go back to the, we can return for a second. I'll back onto Petrarch in a minute. So this encounter between the lovers is really interesting because it's an exchange. It suggests mutuality, that two-ness again, two households both alike in dignity that we saw at the beginning, but that whereas they were divided, separated, these are two people coming together. And that exchange is actually 14 lines long, so it makes a sonnet. And it's one of the most famous lovers' meetings in the whole of world literature, I think. And it's a really marvelous moment. And you'll notice there are a lot of religious elements there too, that, saints do not move. The reference to saints is interesting. Well, the play is set in Catholic Italy, but from the 1530s, King Henry VIII, who was Elizabeth I's father, had actually broken from the Church of Rome. And while Italy remained Catholic, England had become a Protestant country. And with Henry VIII, although, it was still largely Catholic in practice, but he had broken from Rome. Then his son, Edward, had taken the throne. Edward was a very fierce Protestant, very firmly Protestant. He made the country way more Protestant, but then he died as an adolescent. And his sister, Mary Tudor, who was married to King Philip of Spain, took over, and she reversed the country to Catholicism just to confuse everybody. But then she died, and Elizabeth I came on the throne, and back they went to Protestantism. Now, all this is very confusing, but I think this opening line of the play, two households both alike in dignity, this inexplicable difference between the two. Well, the big difference that Shakespeare couldn't talk about directly, but that really influenced kind of every play ever written in the period, was the Reformation and this religious divide. So it's not specific, but religious language really comes in. And even though the play is set in Catholic Italy, and palm to palm is holy palmers kiss as the lovers touch hands. The palmers were pilgrims who went to Jerusalem, who had been to Jerusalem and brought palms back, or also went to the shrine of St. James of Compostela. So the associations with fairly Catholic notions of pilgrimage there too. And the idea of saints, and that saints don't move, i.e. plaster statues of saints, which had just been removed from parish churches all over England. And we know that Shakespeare's own church had its images taken down, and the paintings on the wall were whitewashed, because you didn't want this kind of truck with saints. But this language of religion is transposed into a language of eroticism. It's about romantic love. Just keeping an eye on the time here. So so that there's that sense that this difference could be about religion. There's another element here. Before Romeo meets Juliet, he's in love with somebody else in both the opera and the play. He's in love with Rosaline. And Rosaline is what we know as a Petrarchan lady. This is Dan's cue, if you would, Dan, to put up the image of the Italian poet Francesco Petrarch, who died in 1374. And he was kind of the inventor of the sonnet sequence in the vernacular, i.e. in the language that people actually spoke, rather than in Latin. And he wrote a lot in Latin, and he always said his Latin works were his most important, etc. But he spent years and years and years writing these poems to his beloved, who was called Laura, or Laura. And Laura also means air, and it's the thought of the suspirations of the poet's breath. And he's got this these laurel leaves on his head, because that's how you crown a poet. And Laura also refers to these the leaves of the poet. But the thing about Laura was she was cold, chaste, and not at all interested in Petrarch. And actually, we don't in the sequence they never even speak to one another. And the whole thing, which goes on even 30 years after Laura has died, Petrarch is still writing about her. And we don't know whether she's a real woman or whether she's a fiction of the poet's imagination. She's probably a bit of both. But he was a cleric, so shouldn't have been marrying anyway, though he did have mistress and had children by the mistress. So that's kind of interesting. So Rosaline comports to this idea of the chaste, inaccessible Petrarchan lady, as she's called. She's icy, and she's the enemy of the poet. Why is she the enemy of the poet? Because her cruelty, her refusal to requite his love is what makes him despair. And all his poems are about his melancholy and his disastrous life after he's fallen in love with Laura. The integrity of his identity, his inner world, totally collapses. Now, this isn't what happens in Shakespeare, and we can leave Petrarch now. Shakespeare's achievement in Romeo and Juliet is that he makes all these really important innovations on the Petrarchan tradition, which the opera picks up on, namely this sense of mutuality, and that the two are going to get married. Not only do they meet and fall in love and they exchange with one another, they marry, and there is the prospect in the play that they could live happily ever after, although the chorus has told us that's not going to happen. And the story is well known, so we know it's not going to happen. But there's a sense that it could have happened had it not been for the recalcitrance of the parents and the hatred that beset the society. So that's a really important innovation. Now, as I told you, Petrarch died in 1374, but it took a really, really long time for the idea of the sonnet to move to England. We're slow with everything in England. The cappuccino machine was not around in my childhood. It was about 1989 before it appeared. We didn't get a Starbucks till I think well into the 90s. You know, so we're behind on things. Things are slow. So, but by the 1590s, there is a craze in sonnet writing, absolute craze. And Shakespeare really makes this poem, it makes this play almost a sonnet in its entirety, with the sonnet at the beginning, and then we have the ideas of the sonnet that permeate the play. And he makes literal the idea of the beloved as the enemy. You know, so your beloved, you really love her, but if she's Laura, nothing's happening. And Romeo, tells us, oh, you know, if I forswear this devout religion of mine eye that he has for Rosaline, that he should be called a heretic. And that's really interesting, that to be faithless even to this woman who doesn't love you is heresy. And obviously he does commit that, because immediately he sees Juliet, as we just saw, he falls madly in love with her. So he's a less mature figure really than Juliet. Now, the other thing about the Petrarchan sonnets is they're all about Petrarch. They're all about the man, his misery, his torment, and so on. Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet turns this around, and we see an awful lot about Juliet. We see her through essentially 2 weddings and 2 funerals. You know, the film 4 Weddings and a Funeral. This is 2 weddings and 2 funerals. We see the world from her point of view. Very often we know about her childhood through the nurse. And obviously in the opera, Gertrude, the nurse, is a very powerful figure, an important figure there. And it's Juliet who says, if he be married, my wedding, my grave had like to be my wedding bed, i.e., you know, I'll just be dead. And she says, now I must love a loathed enemy. So he literalizes this antipathy that is inherent in the Petrarchan tradition. I hope you all understand me. This is going into a bit of literary history here. He makes it a literal, so that the beloved is the enemy in external terms. And he's really taking up this main idea from the sonnets, but he's making it into a whole play. And the sonnet exchange is mutual and hopeful, and and really about pure love that cannot come to fulfillment in this kind of society. Now, one of the other things that happens is, of course, after Tybalt's death, Capulet has been engaged in marriage negotiations, and prior to meeting Romeo, Juliet has said, okay, if looked alike and looking liking move, I will no more deep and dark mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly, i.e., I'll wait for parental consent. But she meets Romeo, and then she knows she cannot marry Paris, whom she's supposed to meet also at the party. Of course, she doesn't meet him, she meets Romeo. And I think what's important then is that after Tybalt's death, suddenly Capulet says, you've got to get married immediately. And to this person you've never encountered, you have to marry the County Paris. And in a way, this is not dissimilar from comedy, because in comedy, there's always an obstacle to love. And the obstacle is often the irate old man. And the irate old man, the literary term is the Latin one, the senex iratus, the sort of senile old devil who just, makes trouble. And usually his objections are overcome. But in this case, the momentum of hatred in this society is such that it can't be overcome. So let's have another look at the wonderful young performers. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact, just notice Juliet in this scene. She keeps trying to get a word in, and the outraged Capulet won't let her, father won't let her get a word in anyway. She's silenced by him. So very important.
How now, wife? Have you delivered to her our decree?
Aye, sir, but she will none. She gives you thanks. I would the fool were married to her grave.
Soft, take me with you, wife. How? Will she not? Doth she not give us thanks? Is she not proud? Doth she not count her blessed, unworthy as she is, that we have wrought so worthy a gentleman to be her bride?
Not proud you have, but thankful that you have. Proud can I never be of what I hate, but thankful even for hate that is meant love.
How? Chopped logic? What is this? Proud, and I thank you not, and yet not proud. Mistress Minion, you thank me no thankings, not proud me no prouds, but fettle your fine joints against Thursday's next, to go with Paris to St. Peter's Church, or I will drag thee on a hurdle thither. Out, you green sickness carrion! Out, you baggage, you tallow face!
Fie, what are you, mad?
Good father, I beseech you on my knees, hear me with patience, but to speak a word.
Thee, young baggage, disobedient wretch. I tell thee what, get thee to church on Thursday, or never look me in the face. Speak not, reply not, do not answer me. My fingers itch. Wife, we scarce thought us blessed that God had lent us but this only child. But now I see this one is one too much, and that we have a curse in having her.
And after that, he says, I wish the fool were married to her grave, which is a really terrible thing to say about your own daughter. And of course, it happens. He gets his wish, which of course he doesn't really want. That my fingers itches. I want to hit her. I want to strike her. And notice that, good father, give me patience, but to speak a word. This incapacity to speak, this silencing, that comes up in just about every work of Shakespeare. The idea of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, very, very, very important. And that Juliet is denied it. The other, get thee to St. Peter's Church, you've got to get married, or I will drag thee on a hurdle thither. Hurdles were these contraptions that they would drag heretics to be burnt at the stake on. You would be dragged to your death. So very, again, a really violent image of what could happen to people who contravened the Orthodox religion or for some other issue, but primarily that being dragged through the streets on a hurdle. So this embedded within that speech is this image of what divides England and English society. I mean, Shakespeare certainly can't put that up front. That would be, prohibited. The word would be totally censored, but it's embedded in there. So that's really a kind of important idea. And that Capulet, he's outraged when he in his initial negotiations with County Paris, he says, my earth hath swallowed all my hopes but she is the hopeful lady of my earth. And that the earth has swallowed, we get the sense that they've perhaps had children who've died in infancy, which is very, very common, and that she's the heir. And now he's, they're in these marriage negotiations. Now, I did once spend an entire summer at the Huntington Library, and I went through all the documents I could find about marriage negotiations. It's when I was preparing this edition, and it's very interesting. There were just screeds and screeds of marriage negotiations, documents about land, about money, about exchanges. It's a really important issue in the period, and I guess anybody even who's ever been married or in a partnership with somebody knows, in a way, you don't only marry the person you're marrying, you marry their relatives at some level. it's all involved. But at this period, it was even more important. And the other thing is to know from a contextual point of view is that marriage wasn't the clear-cut issue that it is today. You didn't have to get married in church in Elizabethan England. If I said, I marry you, and you said it back, especially if there was a witness, but it didn't have to be. Marriage was understood as a verbal contract. It was called verba di presenti, between two people. But there was an endeavor to regularize this and engage in church marriages. And Romeo and Juliet do have that church marriage. It's just that it's clandestine. But people sometimes objected to these. When John Donne, the poet John Donne, married Anne Moore in secret with a few witnesses, George Moore, her father, tried to have the marriage annulled, but it was kind of too late then by this stage. But nonetheless, they lived pretty much in poverty till John Donne took holy orders and became a member of the Church of England and became a cleric. He didn't have a regular income until then. So you could suffer real material consequences for violating this sense of thing. And then, of course, it's the separation of the lovers, like Tristan and Isolde. All the great love stories in a way involve this tragic separation. And this is what happens. And it's the other fascinating thing about the plays. We see Juliet looking forward to her wedding night. And the lyrical poem there is called an epithalamion. She says, gallop apace, ye fiery-footed steeds. And these are the horses that take the chariot of the sun toward night. And she's looking forward to her wedding night. Again, it's a very frank expression of erotic desire. You might be a bit worried about that if you have a 14-year-old daughter, but it's very frank and beautiful lyrical expression. And again, that's a deviation from the lyrical tradition that Shakespeare is working with in Petrarch, where you really don't see the woman's side of it at all. We see far more of Juliet's interior life. And again, I think that's very significant. And when you think that these plays are being performed by the young women are being performed mainly by young male actors, adolescents or a little bit older perhaps, that's really kind of remarkable achievement, you know, for an actor to pull that off. And I thought our actors today did a really brilliant job of that. So normally, the play up to Act 3 is a comedy. You could overcome these obstacles. There are, in Midsummer Night's Dream, the irate old man, the father, Aegeus, threatens death to his daughter, death or confinement to a convent for the rest of her life if she won't marry the person he thinks she should marry. And this obstacle is overcome in the course of the play. But that's not so here. Things take this terrible and tragic turn. And you might think, well, there's all this sword fighting on stage, which if you ever performed in Romeo and Juliet, it's a really serious part of the play. And again, Shakespeare's playing on the big issues of his day. Enforced marriage is a huge issue. There's even an act put into Parliament, it doesn't get approved, to make it so that marriages are illegal unless they have parental consent. He's also working with the most popular sport in the period is fencing. And there are various Spanish and Italian sword masters in England. And they dropped the big old English broadsword, which Capulet says, I'm going to get my broadsword to get rid of this affray when the violence breaks out in the streets. But what comes in is the rapier, the light Italian weapon, that instead of having to go off somewhere and get your broadsword, you can carry this round with you, and you can conveniently stab people who annoy you or get on the wrong side of the pavement. Very, very handy. And it's kind of the Super Bowl of its time. I mean, it's the most popular sport. And there was a chap called Vincenzo Saviolo, and he had an academy in London, and he wrote a book about fencing, and it was incredibly popular. So this is why Shakespeare's got these fencing scenes in there too. this is, he wants bums on seats. These are all hot button issues, and he treads carefully around the religious issue, but it's still in there. It's an integral kind of part of the play. So things go awry after the sword fighting, and I often wonder if Shakespeare's thinking about his own contemporary, Christopher Marlowe, who a few years before was given a restraining order against a chap called William Bradley, and Marlowe and his friend Thomas Watson, another playwright, were out in the street, and they stabbed and killed this chap William Bradley in the street. And it's the account of the killing says he was stabbed under the arm of Christopher Marlowe. So really incredible. So I often wonder if that was what was in Shakespeare's mind. Of course, I don't know. Things then, go awry within the play. There's a whole business with Friar Lawrence providing this sleeping potion, and Juliet doesn't just say, "Oh wow, I'll take this. It'll be great. It'll solve all my problems." She says, "What if the friar has put something that will kill me in here?" She's rightly worried, and there's often been because the friar is a Catholic religious figure, there's often been this sort of concern that, how do we read Friar Lawrence? Are we supposed to trust him, not trust him? He's sort of key to the machinery of the play, to the plot. He's the one who explains everything at the ends of the play. Really important, because, the parents need to know what's happened. But there are these moments where Juliet is a bit skeptical about him. And I'm always interested in that, because I think, there have been lots of debates about whether Shakespeare was Catholic or Protestant. And, we'll never know. I think most people in England were just a bit confused and went along with whatever they thought wouldn't get them imprisoned or killed. So I think that's my own, perhaps controversial opinion. And I just don't think this is something that we will ever know. But I think there is a degree of skepticism in there about Friar Lawrence, but it's also the natural skepticism you would have about anything. I mean, if any of you have ever had an anesthetic, you always think, gee, I hope I'll wake up from this. So I think that, but again, this interiority of the woman, of the female figure, really, really important and very much an innovation. The other thing, I should say, so Friar Lawrence is a bit of a dubious figure, but at the end clearly explains everything, and he's a kind of vehicle. But it would allow those members of the audience who'd be thinking, who's this Catholic clergyman on stage in Shakespeare's audience, to really get their collywobbles addressed a little bit there, but also this interior moment for Juliet. So the other thing about this tradition that Shakespeare's writing about, obviously Petrarch's medieval Catholic, late high Middle Ages, before the Reformation. The Reformation doesn't get going until the 16th century with Martin Luther, when he allegedly puts his famous theses on the door of the Wittenberg parish church. But the sonnet, does a couple of things. His tradition, was written in Italian. And that's important, not just because it gave somebody like Shakespeare later on the right to say, and other English poets to say, gee, we should use the English language. Okay, it's a mix of all these weird languages, bits of Anglo-Saxon, French, it's a bit of a hodgepodge, but maybe we can make it into a literary language. So that's very important in terms of the language of the play. But also that the sonnets are songs, the canzoniere, songs. And we know that Petrarch actually worked with a lyre as he was composing the songs. And I've been to the Vatican Library and looked at the manuscripts, and you can see his musical notations in the margins of the manuscript. So that's kind of fascinating. So this idea of singing, I think, is something that is very appropriately taken up in the opera. And there was this sense, though, that music and poetry were not so terribly divorced in this period. That's very important. But sonnets were being printed and being read. And remember, print's fairly new, and sonnets are short, in small books often. And, they're an intimate act of reading. And also this sense of intimacy, and they're often about love. And so that sense of erotic intimacy with the poem, with language, with a lover, is also something Shakespeare really conveys in the play itself. The sense that this incredibly intimate relationship, which could have gone, this love that could have lasted forever, that could have been happy, that gets kind of killed. And there is another reason, I think, that Shakespeare explores the potential happiness of Romeo and Juliet. And that's because in Catholicism, medieval Catholicism, the highest state of life was to be a monk or a nun, an ascetic. You'd live in a monastery, you'd be celibate. All that changed, and priests were unmarried. They were like Petrarch, maybe having a bit away on the side, but they weren't meant to. So that's a kind of important factor. And there are lots of treatises then in Elizabethan England that reverse things and say, look, marriage is the highest state of life. And what this did was also to give more importance to women, because very patriarchal society. We just saw Capulet, old Capulet there, Lord Capulet raging, patriarchal household, you know, the man is the king of his house. He tells the daughter and the wife what to do, end of story. But this emphasis on marriage meant that you really had to deal with the women, with the wives. And there are actually while there are some very patriarchal Protestant tracts, no doubt, there are some really beautiful ones which say, you know, marriage is an adventure that two young people take together, and that they should be alike. Remember that word alike, two households both alike, that they should be alike in piety and in world circumstances. Faith, condition, and piety were the words that were used. And also age was often a big one, but we won't go into that. So it was that sense that marriage was newly important, and that it was a godly condition, and that God had ordained it, and from Adam and Eve, and that therefore, you know, this is a marriage. This is not just a love affair, any old love affair. This is a marriage, and it's a marriage that dissolves because of the hatred of people outside it, but it is the absolute epitome of human love and the foundation of the family. And so that Protestant idea gets worked in there too. And again, I do not believe that this says anything in particular about what Shakespeare's own personal religious beliefs were, but I think these discourses are available at the time, and that he avails himself of those. So he takes a Petrarchan tradition about unrequited love, where your poetry is generated by the fact that she will never love you back. He moves it into a play where the enemy is really, the notion of enmity is outside the lovers. And, you know, and Romeo has that beautiful line. He says, you know, maybe a Montague, but if I had it written, I would tear the word, because this love dissolves that hatred and that identity that's been foisted upon this couple by, you know, by their families. I think I might be nearly, I might have 3 minutes left, I don't know, to talk about this. So those are ideas. The context of Shakespeare's writing is really significant in that he's, you know, he's clearly playing to an audience, and he's thinking about the ideas of his time, and he's also inherited this this lyrical tradition. But that lyrical tradition does not have a happy ending, and nor does Shakespeare's tragedy. And it's interesting, Samuel Pepys once said, you know, he was writing in the 17th century, said, this is the worst play I ever saw in my life. They both die at the end. It's just terrible. It could have been happy. And so there was a rewrite in the Restoration where it had a happy ending. So, you know, because not everybody, because ideas had changed by then. But I suspect that in Shakespeare's own audiences, there were people who thought, you know, it's a tragedy in the way that we say it's a tragedy that young people died of a drug overdose or something. They felt it was, you know, that something wrong had been done and it was a tragedy, but it was kind of not, it wasn't really the fault of the parents or whatever. But Shakespeare is really clear. He's on the side of the lovers. He brings us onto the side of the lovers, and he makes us believe that this marriage, this love could have lasted forever. And at the very end of the play, Capulet and Montague say they will raise statues in pure gold, and to the lovers they will raise this monument and they will end their enmity. As the chorus has predicted, it was only the death of their children that could actually achieve this outcome. But even then, there's this competition between the two. Capulet says, "I'll raise, a statue to Juliet in pure, Romeo in pure gold. Oh, I'll raise one to Juliet in pure gold too," says Montague. So that as Rich by his lady's side, so there's this even in the end of the play, there's potentially this competition between the two of them. But by and large, there is the feeling that things have been resolved, and that the Duke, who has the last words in the play, has finally got control over Verona's streets. And those streets have been occupied by belligerent young men. He's had a hard time dealing with them. And these feuding families have not really obeyed the power of the state, the power of the Duke Aeschylus. And this was a problem that Elizabeth I also had. There were feuding families. There was the rebellion of the Northern Earls, ancient hatreds, and that went on. And she had to try and kind of crack the whip, centralize the state, get people to get married in churches so that the state knew what was happening, and to regularize things. And in a way, those moves actually worked to liberate children from their parents, and their parents' sometimes tyrannical desires about who they should marry. So the play deals with all of this. I could say a lot more, but you know what? I'm going to leave it there because I think we're out of time. And we could take questions if there's time for questions.
Oh, Dr. Callaghan, thank you so much. It's amazing to listen to you speak. And you just have this magnificent brain and a wonderful way of explaining all of this. So much of this stuff, even for those of us who have studied Shakespeare, is completely new. So thank you so much for that.